Out of this tumult, spirit would be thrown back to its starting point, to the ethical and real world of culture, which would have been merely refreshed and rejuvenated by the fear of the Lord and Master, which has again entered men's hearts. Spirit would have to traverse anew and continually repeat this cycle of necessity if the result were only the complete interpenetration of self-consciousness and substance, an interpenetration in which self-consciousness, which has experienced the negative power of its universal essence acting on it, would desire to know and find itself, not as this particular individual, but only as a universal, and therefore too would be able to endure the objective reality of a universal spirit, a reality excluding self-consciousness qua particular. But in absolute freedom, there was no reciprocal action between a consciousness that is immersed in the complexities of existence or that sets itself specific aims and thoughts and a valid external world, whether of reality or thought. Instead, the world was absolutely in the form of consciousness as a universal will. And equally, self-consciousness was drawn together out of the whole expanse of existence or manifested aims and judgments and concentrated into the simple self. The culture to which it attains in interaction with that essence is therefore the grandest and the last, is that of seeing its pure, simple reality immediately vanish and pass away into empty nothingness. In the world of culture itself, it does not get as far as to behold its negation or alienation in this form of pure abstraction. On the contrary, its negation is filled with a content, either honor or wealth, which it gains in place of the self that it is alienated from itself. Or the language of spirit, an insight which the disrupted consciousness acquires. Or it is the heaven of faith, or the utility of the enlightenment. All these determinations have vanished in the loss suffered by the self in absolute freedom. Its negation is the death that is without meaning, the sheer terror of the negative that contains nothing positive, nothing that fills it with a content. At the same time, however, this negation in its real existence is not something alien. It is neither the universal, inaccessible necessity in which the ethical world perishes, nor the particular accident of private possession, nor the whim of the owner on which the disrupted consciousness sees itself dependent. On the contrary, it is the universal will, which in this, its ultimate abstraction, has nothing positive and therefore can give nothing in return for the sacrifice. But for that very reason, it is immediately one with self-consciousness, or it is the pure positive, because it is the pure negative. And the meaningless death, the unfulfilled negativity of the self, changes round in its inner notion into absolute positivity. For consciousness, the immediate unity of itself with the universal will, its demand to know itself as the specific point in the universal will, is changed round into the absolutely opposite experience. What vanishes for it in that experience is abstract being, or the immediacy of that insubstantial point. And this vanished immediacy is the universal will itself, which it now knows itself to be insofar as it is a pure knowing or a pure will. Consequently, it knows that will to be itself and knows itself to be essential being, but not essential being as an immediate existence, not will as revolutionary government or anarchy striving to establish anarchy, nor itself as the center of this faction or the opposite faction. On the contrary, the universal will is its pure knowing and willing, and it is the universal will qua this pure knowing and willing. It does not lose itself in that will, for pure knowing and willing is much more it than is that atomic point of consciousness. It is thus the interaction of pure knowing with itself. Pure knowing, qua essential being, is the universal will. But this essential being is absolutely nothing else but pure knowing. Self-consciousness is therefore the pure knowing of essential being, qua pure knowing. Further, as an individual self, it is only the form of the subject or of real action, a form which is known by it as form. Similarly, objective reality, being, is for it simply a selfless form. For that reality would be something that is not known. This knowing, however, knows knowing to be essential being. Paragraph 594 is the second to last paragraph in this section, It's very long. There's a lot going on in there. It probably could have been split up into multiple paragraphs, but instead Hegel brings all of this material together in a sort of culmination, very much like what a composer might do in bringing things to a kind of crescendo, whether we're talking about classical music or we're thinking about various forms of rock music. I'm not really competent to talk about other genres of music in that respect. And what's going on here? Hegel is really doing two main things. One is drawing this contrast between the development that took place in consciousness in this transition to what he's calling the grandest and last culture, that of the absolute freedom and the terror and where we're going from there. Something has happened to self-consciousness, something new that we didn't see in the previous shapes of self-consciousness developed in the earlier dynamics in the culture section and then in the faith and enlightenment discussions that were taking place. That's one thing that's going on. The other thing that's going on is he's preparing our transition to the next big section of Spirit, the last section of Spirit, which is morality, moral consciousness. And you might say, well, that's been there the whole time. The term moral, and we'll talk much more about this later when we get into it, he's using that for a specific reason as opposed to ethical. And there's a kind of universality involved there that it took an achievement on human beings' parts to get us there. That's part of this last and grandest culture that he's referring to. So, a lot of material. Let's look at the text itself, see what Hegel has to say. Out of this tumult, what's the tumult? The reversion back into the spiritual masses and spheres in absolute freedom. He says spirit would be thrown back to its starting point. So we would have this cyclical transformation. Here I want to say something a little bit about the development within the Phenomenology of Spirit and in Hegelian philosophy more generally that I think often gets left out, in part because we're really looking at a story that's being told about the development of human consciousness over time, but we're only looking at certain representative places and times where it's developing further. So what we're leaving out is the fact that in most places and times, things are proceeding in a cyclical manner. So, the French Revolution happens, and that's happening in France, and it's going to spill over into the rest of the continent. Of course, something different is going on in America, but that's also influenced by it as well. And what's happening in other places? What's happening in Spain? What's happening in North Africa? What's happening in the Egypt that Napoleon, conquered and got booted out of? It's not the same thing. The older dynamics remain in place, churning away there. So spirit develops for Hegel in particular places and times, cultures, and individuals. And it is quite possible for you to have what he's just calling here, spirit being thrown back to its starting point. And what is its starting point in this section? The ethical and real world of culture. And he says there would have been something gained in the process, being refreshed and rejuvenated by the fear of the Lord and Master, which has again entered men's hearts. We see something like this all the time when we witness calls for cultural renewal that are based on raising the stakes. If we just had a good war, that would liven everything up and shake things and get people to be men again. This is a theme that gets said over and over and over again. By the way, Hegel himself can sometimes say things like that, for example, in his Reason in History. But here, that's not what's going on. Hegel is not suggesting that we should simply, go back to business as usual now with a little bit more liveliness involved because we tasted the fear of death but didn't die in the process. No, we need something different instead. He says spirit, if that was the case, would have to go through this entire dynamic once again. It would have to, as he says, traverse anew and continually repeat this cycle of necessity if something was the case. Now, what's the key differentiating factor here? That's what he's going to tell us. Here's how he expresses it. If the result were only the complete interpenetration of self-consciousness and substance. Very metaphysical way of talking, right? What is he on about there? Well, the substance is the, you might say, ways in which society is organized, understood, and ruled. Self-consciousness is the individual, the person. Persons, of course, because it's plural. We're never abstractly just talking about one person in a solipsistic way as being, the one person in relation to society. But we can think of this writ large, you might say. So he says this is an interpenetration in which self-consciousness, which experienced the negative power of its universal essence acting on it, would desire to know and find itself not as this particular individual, but only as a universal. So what Hegel is saying happened in the previous developments of self-consciousness is there's some kind of universal, something beyond the individual, and the individual tries to find him or herself in relation to that, perhaps even by a sort of fusion or completely abasing itself before that. The obedience of the previous shapes of self-consciousness could fit in there. This is not going to be something available in the absolute freedom and terror development. So he goes on and he says, this would enable it to endure the objective reality of universal spirit, a reality excluding self-consciousness qua particular. In the earlier shapes, insofar as you were just a particular, you were, in essence, the fly in the ointment. Or, not to put too fine a point on it, evil, böse, the bad, right? We had the noble self-consciousness, and then we had the base self-consciousness, which, of course, turned out to be the one who truly had the advantage. And we saw this development in earlier sections as well. Think about virtue in the way of the world, right? The law of the heart and the frenzy of self-conceit. Even pleasure didn't work like that. Pleasure led into death. So he says, there's something different going on here. What is it? In absolute freedom, for the first time, there was no, as he says, reciprocal action between a consciousness immersed in the complexities of existence, losing itself within the complexities of the socialized world, or its activities, or any of those sorts of things, or that sets itself specific aims and thoughts, right? Specific goals, Zwecke, and things to consider. Think about the reason section. And, so all of that is on one side, and a valid external world, a world that you're part of, but which is different from you, whether, he says, of reality or of thought. So this can be, and what does he mean by valid? Does he mean, true in the sense of, we finally hit the bedrock of everything? No, working for you at the time, part of your realm of experience, allowing you to make sense out of things. So now he's going to give us some examples of this, right? First, though, he tells us the culture. Here we go. Instead, the world was absolutely in the form of consciousness as a universal will. This is how what we've just traversed is different. And equally, self-consciousness was drawn together out of the whole expanse of existence or manifested aims and judgments, concentrated into a single self. See, the stakes have been raised in a unique way in absolute freedom and the terror. Every self-consciousness could see itself in that universal will. How do you know that something is actually the universal will? You as a rational self-consciousness can come to grasp it, whether you're some illiterate peasant You can be brought to literacy and educated about, social policy and what's rational. Or whether you're some legislator, whether you're belonging to a privileged class who now is going to have to recognize that its privileges are arbitrary and should give them up, or whether you're part of the rising bourgeoisie who, view themselves as becoming the essential class. Something different has happened here. The world that was opposed to one is, on the one hand, interpenetrated by you as the individual. And on the other hand, it's composed of other individuals, and you can ask, why does that guy get to run the show? Why not me? I'm just as rational as he is. I'm just as free. Isn't that what, freedom, equality, and fraternity ought to mean? We all take turns running the show. Why are you in charge, Robespierre? Why are you in charge? Why a committee? Right? So something has changed here. He says, self-consciousness is drawn together out of this whole expanse of existence or manifested aims and judgments concentrated into a single self, and that single self ends up being the one that runs the show, right? So he says the culture to which it attains in interaction with that essence is therefore the grandest and the last. Last, not necessarily in the sense of we never have any culture after that, but it's another way of translating last here. Would be the latest. It is the latest on the scene, right? Grandest, erhabenste, right? So he goes on and he says, it's that of seeing its pure, simple reality immediately vanish and pass away into empty nothingness. Hegel's not using the word nihilism here, right? That's a later concept. But this is something that is coming on the scene in a way different from the other places where we've pointed it out in, say, the culture section. There is a nothingness, a negativity inhabiting the entire social fabric, ready to pop out at any moment, that can take determinate form as suspicion, as terror, as death, which itself is a negativity or nothingness, right? So he says, in the world of culture itself, the previous dynamics, it does not get, self-consciousness, it does not get as far as to behold its negation or alienation in this form of pure abstraction, Hegel says. A pure abstraction that can be, on the other hand, very concrete. My concern in my very core about my death. So he goes on and he says, on the contrary, the negation is filled with a content. Now, what is he talking about there? Some sort of universal that we frame ourselves in relation to. What are the contents that were available in previous dynamics and the shapes of consciousness that went along with them? He says it's, in culture, right? It's filled with either honor or wealth, which it gains in place of the self that it is alienated from itself. So honor in terms of state power, the obedient, serving, noble consciousness is honored in the process. It loses some of who it is. And it gains a universal in relation to that. Wealth is a universal as well, as we discovered, and the base self-consciousness may arrange itself in relation to that as the one who starts to gain wealth, and then can, attain a different sort of consciousness. Both types of consciousness have to frame themselves in relation to wealth because you need it to get things done and can be bought out by that. And then he goes on and he says, or the language of spirit and insight, which the disrupted consciousness acquires. I don't have that here on the board, but that's the one who falls through the cracks. The nephew of Ramo in Diderot's story, the person who is ironic, the person who can't find a place to fit into the culture and yet can't escape the culture either. And then we move on to the world of pure thought, right? The world as understood through pure thought. And he says, or it is the heaven of faith. heaven in some determinate form, whether it be understood in terms of the heaven as conceived by various Christian thinkers, or by Muslims, or all sorts of other conceptions available in terms of faith. Of course, here in Europe, and in the development of the consciousness that's leading to the French Revolution, we're talking about Christianity, many different conceptions of heaven. All you got to do is read through some of the literature of the time where people are trying to describe it. You get the basest forms of sort of sensual self-gratification, all the way to the most sublime understandings of concord, love, and sort of a almost reflection of love into itself, encompassing all individuals, say in Anselm of Canterbury. So he goes on and he says, or the utility of the Enlightenment. Now, what's the upshot here? It says all of these determinations, all of these things that we can orient ourselves towards as values, as things that could arrange our life meaningfully, our aims, our actions, our relations with other people. He says all of these have vanished in the loss suffered by the self in absolute freedom. Absolute freedom, working itself out, realizing itself, is more of a loss than a gain with respect to everything else that came before it. So, what has been gained then? He says its negation, the negation of absolute freedom, is the death without meaning, the sheer terror of the negative that contains nothing positive, nothing that fills it with a content. It has had the effect not just of sort of wiping the slate clean, but of shattering the slate and putting nothing else in its place and urging the self-consciousness to, at the same time, find something else that's going to be put in its place. This is a significant problem, is it not? So he says, the ethical world, it's neither the universal inaccessible necessity in which the ethical world perishes, nor the particular accident of private possession, nor the whim of the owner on which the disrupted consciousness sees itself dependent. On the contrary, what is absolute freedom? It is the universal will, which in its ultimate abstraction has nothing positive and can give nothing for the sacrifice. In all the previous forms of consciousness, you alienated yourself, you sacrificed something of yourself, and got something else in the process, and tried to pretend like that was, fulfillment. Here, you're still alienating, you're still sacrificing, and you're getting a big bag of nothing, except death, as your payoff. Now, you might say, well, that sounds terrible. What the hell kind of culture is that? Right? Purely nihilistic, if we want to think about it that way. Now, here's where Hegel tells us there's an important gain. For that very reason, he says, it's immediately one with self-consciousness. Because it's the pure negative, it's also the pure positive. And the meaningless death, he says, the unfilled negativity of the self, changes around in its inner notion into absolute positivity. Something new comes on the scene. So he says the immediate unity of consciousness with the universal will, its demand, this is a beautiful way of framing it, to know itself as this specific point in the universal will is changed around into the exact opposite experience. What vanishes for it is its abstract being, or the immediacy of that insubstantial point. And this vanished immediacy is the universal will itself, which now it knows self-consciousness, individual self-consciousness, knows itself to be, insofar as it is a pure knowing or pure will. I, as this guy here, am just as much a center of the ethical universe, the intellectual universe, as any one of those other poor bastards out there, or whoever is in charge and who can threaten me with death. All of us are, in a certain respect, by participating in this culture, placed, or rather elevated, to a higher plane. This is that last and grandest culture. So he goes on and he says, consequently, it knows that will. What will? The general, the universal will. It knows that to be itself and knows itself to be essential being. But not essential being as an immediate existence. And now notice what else Hegel's ruling out here. Not will as revolutionary government or anarchy striving to establish anarchy, nor itself as the center of this faction or the opposite faction. All these struggles that are going on, these determinate struggles within the revolutionary sphere. On the contrary, he says, this universal will is pure knowing and pure will. Right? He says, this universal will is pure knowing and willing. It is the universal will qua this knowing and willing. This is going to transition us to the realm of what Hegel's calling morality. Out of the ethical sphere into the moral sphere. Notice what else he says. It does not lose itself in this will. In the previous dynamics of spirit, you kind of had to lose yourself in wealth or God or utility or whatever it happened to be. Here you get to keep yourself. So he goes on and he says, it does not lose itself, for pure knowing and willing is much more it than is that atomic point of consciousness, the determinacy of who I am. It is thus the interaction of pure knowing with itself, pure knowing qua essential being in the universal will. And this is something worth dwelling on. Notice that Hegel doesn't say pure knowing or thought thinking itself or anything like that. It has to be practical. It has to include not just knowing, but willing in order for it to actually be pure knowing related to itself. It has to be pure knowing involved in action within the world, within determinacy. So he goes on and he says, self-consciousness is, therefore, the pure knowing of essential being qua, or as, that very pure knowing. Then he goes on. Further, as an individual self, it is only the form of the subject or of real action, a form which is known by it as form. Again, we're getting to the willing part through that. And here you should start to see some shades of Kant, shouldn't you? The pure form of the action. I'm not going to say much about that here because that's going to come up later. So he goes on and he says, similarly, objective reality, being, is for it simply a selfless form, for that reality would be something that is not known. But this knowing knows knowing to be essential being. So we come to a new culture in which we conceive of ourselves primarily as beings that are engaged in knowing and willing, and all of us have the same capacities for that, at least ideally, as anybody else does who has transitioned here. So we are not going to slip right back into this old dynamic of culture. We're going to make an advance. Absolute freedom has thus removed the antithesis between the universal and the individual will. The self-alienated spirit, driven to the extreme of its antithesis, in which pure willing and the agent of that pure willing are still distinct, reduces the antithesis to a transparent form and therein finds itself. Just as the realm of the real world passes over into the realm of faith and insight, so does absolute freedom leave its self-destroying reality and pass over into another land of self-conscious spirit, where in this unreal world, freedom has the value of truth. In the thought of this truth, spirit refreshes itself, insofar as it is and remains thought and knows this being which is enclosed within self-consciousness to be essential being in its perfection and completeness. There has arisen the new shape of spirit, that of the moral spirit. With paragraph 595, we now come to the end of Absolute Freedom and Terror, which itself is the last section of this middle portion of Spirit, a very long set of paragraphs. And we're ready to move now into the next section, of spirit, which is morality. So Hegel is going to talk about a new shape of consciousness that has arrived on the scene, the moral spirit. And we should dwell a little bit on how we actually get to this before we launch into that new section. He tells us that absolute freedom has thus removed the antithesis, the Gegensatz, between the universal and the individual will. And, what was the individual will? It could be that of the person who doesn't have power. It can be the person who's in power. The universal or general will was supposed to be this thing that everybody could participate in some way. And we saw that it took some development in order for that to come to fruition. And it didn't come to fruition ultimately through a new arrangement of merely social relations. That was what the revolution was attempting to do. But through a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding itself in relation to human history and in relation between the individuals and the universal will that is somehow being articulated as their will, pure knowing, pure willing. He goes on and he says that this self-alienated spirit is driven to the extreme of this antithesis, right? And what else does he tell us about this antithesis? We have pure willing and the agent of that pure willing, and they're still distinct from each other. Now, there's a little bit of a fine translation, but could be a little bit misleading. We have pure willing, rein wollen. Wollen is the verb there, and it's being used to denote the actual willing itself. And then we have the willer, the agent of willing. It's very difficult to say how you could translate this better. The thing that's actually engaging in the willing itself, the rein wollende, right? So agent, that works, but it implies that there's something detached from this agent, or that willing is merely one of its capacities rather than what makes it what it is. Be that as it may, let's go on. So he says that these have been separated out from each other in this antithesis, and now we want to reduce, as he says, the antithesis to a transparent form, and therein the self-alienated spirit finds itself. It finds itself. This spirit that has been separated from itself the entire time in this entire section, and really the sections before it, is now able to reappropriate itself. The alienation is being overcome. It's not being overcome yet in reality. It's being overcome in, we could say, in potential or in ideality. And the next section is where that is going to really happen. So Hegel tells us that there's a few analogies here. Just as the realm of the real world passes over into the realm of faith and insight, the realm of the real world of culture, right, passes over into an ideal world, which is also real in a certain sense. It's wirklich in that it does, in fact, do things. It does, in fact, motivate people. It does get them to do something. But it's beyond the real wirkliche world that we're accustomed to thinking about. Similarly, there's a transition here when it comes to freedom, absolute freedom, he says. Absolute freedom leaves its self-destroying reality, the self-destroying reality of the real world that it's involved in, the world of the revolution, the world of the terror, the world of governance and faction. And he says it passes over into another land of self-conscious spirit where, in this unreal, unwirklich, not actual, you could say, world, not yet actual would be better. In this unreal world, freedom has, he says, the value of truth. And we're talking about absolute freedom here. Absolute freedom stands, you could say, in place of, can be exchanged for, has the value of truth. The truth that we've been seeking this entire time. He goes on and he says, in the thought of this truth, not in this truth, but in the thinking about this truth, spirit refreshes itself insofar as it is and remains thought and knows this being which is enclosed within self-consciousness to be essential being in its perfection and completeness. Now, this is a very rosy picture, and you can think of this as the outline of where we want to go. Of course, as is always the case with Hegel, these great imaginings at the beginning never turn out to be exactly what we're working with when we look at it more closely and try to make it actual. But let's dwell on that for a moment here. He says, we've got a new shape of spirit, that of the moral spirit. So by leaving the world in which absolute freedom and essentially terror went together behind, and transitioning to a world of thought in which we can have a purer willing, we now enter a new stage. Notice, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, that for Hegel, this cannot be jump-started. It's not simply something that you can hand out as a bunch of tracts to people who are stuck in an earlier dynamic. There is a need for consciousness to work through something like the French Revolution and the Terror in order to arrive at this point.